Hello guys, guys and gamers, and welcome to the Halloween video that you're probably not watching on Halloween, but I'm still gonna be creepy. Today I wanted to talk about Nintendo's relationship with horror games. And I found this topic to be surprisingly difficult to actually talk about because Nintendo doesn't really have a relationship, at least much, when it comes to horror games. So I started thinking, has Nintendo ever made a horror game? I mean, the wonderful thing about Nintendo's lineup of games and the IPs they own, there is a lot of variety. There's platformers, there's simulation games. Animal Crossing counts as life simulation, I guess. There's racing games, there's RPGs, there's fighting games, there's shooters. A lot of games that are attractive for players. And they like to try out new things every once in a while, but have you ever really heard of a Nintendo horror game? That's what I wanted to find out with this video. And that's what we will be discussing now. When you start thinking about Nintendo and horror, the first things that probably come to your mind is just occasional scary parts in Nintendo games, like the Lavender Town in Pokemon Red and Blue, the Shadow Temple of Ocarina of Time 64, or that goddamn piano in Mario 64. But those are not really horror games, they are just spooky parts of regular Nintendo games. Those do not really count. But there are some Nintendo games that do maybe come a bit closer to maybe someone probably somewhere counting them as a horror game, but most people would never say that. One of these games is, of course, the Luigi's Mansion games, where Luigi wins a mansion mysteriously and then has to explore it. That's basically the premise of the game. It's a haunted mansion, but rather than being a scary game, it's rather not, I would say. The ghosts are never a threat. You don't ever feel scared. And that's kind of what I look forward in a horror game. A game that makes me scared, and the intentions of Luigi's Mansion are not really to make the player feel scared. There might be some occasional creepy moments for some, but overall, I don't think many people would say Luigi's Mansion is a horror game. Another game like this is Metroid Fusion. It is a 2D Metroid game that is set after Super Metroid, released for the GBA, I think. And there are certainly some very scary scenarios in the game where you are being hunted down by a clone of Samus with dead looking eyes, and you don't want to get caught. And those moments, I feel like when playing, they definitely felt a bit tense. And I would not be surprised if the intention was to make the player a bit scared on those moments. But those moments are only a few in the whole game. And the overall game is just your standard Metroid thing. So, again, I would not count Metroid Fusion as a horror game, but it does definitely have some intentionally scary moments that make you want to feel afraid. Another popular pick for what might kinda count as a horror game would be Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. The whole game is just dreadful. There's a lot of creepy and sad things throughout the game. But again, while it is a depressing game to play through, I would not go out and say it's a horror game. No. But there are a few games that Nintendo has been involved with that are actual horror games. And the first one I want to talk about in this video is the Fatal Frame series, or Zero, or Project Zero in Europe. It's weird name. I don't like that name. Everyone just call it Fatal Frame. Is such a more catching name, you know? Why name something like Zero that just tells you nothing about the game, while Fatal Frame is just, it's unique. It's such a better name. And they only call the series Fatal Frame in America. It's weird. But Fatal Frame series is a horror game series or horror photography series of games developed by Koei Tecmo. And the series started in 2001 for the PlayStation, but starting with the fourth game, the series has been partly funded and co-developed by Nintendo. However, some of the entries after the fourth game, Koei Tecmo later bought the publishing rights for multi-platform releases. That's why the latest entry, Maiden of Blackwater, while also porting to the Switch, is now also available on PlayStation 5, Xbox One, and Steam, and many other places. Another horror game where Nintendo lent a helping hand was called Geist for the GameCube. It was not developed by Nintendo, but the development was not going well with Geist, so Nintendo helped a bit, and the game became a GameCube exclusive. But the legacy of Geist is not a very good one. The game is awful. I remember researching this game on like Wikipedia and just saying, the last sentence I remember for the article was like, Game Informer calls this game's one of the worst horror movies ever made. It's not really that much of a horror game, not for the lack of trying, but it's just a very bad game. I would not try out Geist. But if you're curious, you can just, emulate it. It's not like Nintendo is gonna like bring these weird horror games to like Virtual Console or anything, because Nintendo doesn't even do GameCube Virtual Console. But I think the most famous out of Nintendo's horror games, or the one that they have been involved with, is of course Eternal Darkness. The Eternal Darkness is an IP that actually Nintendo owns, and the first game in the series, and unfortunately the only one, is kind of a cult classic. It's also for the GameCube, and it was not developed by Nintendo, but I think they funded it a bit. But it is a very famous psychological horror action adventure game that is famous for a lot of like unique mechanics, including the sanity meter, where if you play the game wrong, the things start getting weird. And it's a very interesting game, and I do really recommend you checking it out if you're into horror games. Me personally, not so much. I thought it was a bit silly, but you can give it a try if you want. But that's basically it for Nintendo's horror games that they have really been involved with. So that kind of begs the question, why don't we have more? Why is it only so little? And I think this is just because of Nintendo's kind of image lately. And if you think about it, a lot of the scary stuff, Ocarina of Time, Shadow Temple, Mario 64 Piano, and that kind of stuff, it's in the past. It was GameCube and before. Eternal Darkness, while it was a cult classic game, it has not received any sort of like sequel ever since the first game was released, even though Nintendo owns the IP and trademark, which they didn't have for a few years because they just forgot to renew the trademark, which was not fun for the fans of Eternal Darkness. But nowadays I think they still do own the trademark. But yeah, well, that was interesting. But Nintendo mainly does games for kind of all audiences, or games that could be attractive to the general audience. And with Nintendo's catalog, there's rarely anything M-rated, which is Basically, if you're going to do a horror game, it should be a bit, at least, pushing the boundaries to M-rated at least. Should be scary. Maybe a lot of violence and such is often expected from horror games. And also, Nintendo just focuses with their games in general on the fun and gameplay aspects of their games. And if you think about it, that's not really what horror games are good at. They can be, of course, but that's not a thing that often happens in horror games. They are more about the aesthetics, or more about the story, the vibes. There needs to be scary vibes going on with horror games, and they're not so much about what you do in the game, because a lot of popular horror games, they are just like very basic when it comes to mechanics. If you think about it, you are powerless. You just walk around and maybe you have like a gun and then you have some sort of shooting mechanics, but they are very, very boring when it comes to gameplay. So if you don't enjoy the horror aspects of it, like I don't, unfortunately, the games can feel a bit lacking. And that's something Nintendo looks for. The enjoyment of a lot of Nintendo games comes from the gameplay and the fun you get from playing the game, which is not something horror games often do. And yeah, it's just, I don't think horror games would just like fit their image. Like, imagine Nintendo doing a new IP, something like ARMS, something like Splatoon, but they wanted to make a horror game. I'm not sure if Nintendo fans would be that excited for it. Of course, Nintendo doesn't just make games for their fans, but if they want to try something risky, I think it would be good if the fans were there. It's just, I don't know, if you imagine the average Nintendo fans, do you honestly think they would be interested in a spooky horror game? And if you think about like average spooky horror games, do they feel Nintendo-ish? Not really. It's just, I don't think Nintendo is just fit for them. Of course, they could do something very unique with a horror game, but it would still have to be attractive to all audiences and have fun gameplay, and that is just something very hard to do. Another thing here, of course, is that horror has never really been a big financial hit for Nintendo. Games that have horror elements more so: Ocarina of Time, Mario 64, Pokemon, of course, big games. Luigi's Mansion, horror aesthetics, but not a scary game itself. But looking at like Eternal Darkness, and even if bringing out some like exclusives like ZombiU that was made by Ubisoft for the launch of Wii U, trying to get that more mature audiences to get into that console, never really sold well. Eternal Darkness, cult classic, horrible sales, never really sold well. So I don't think Nintendo would be looking into making a horror game, because they just never been really good at it when it comes to the sales numbers. And when you're thinking about making new games and a new IP, you do want it to be a success, right? So it's kind of understandable. But those are just like my thoughts about this issue. I don't know where else to really go with this. It's just my observations about how Nintendo doesn't really do horror games and kind of why that is. But do you have any other thoughts in your head? Let me know in the comments below, and I will be sure to answer you guys. I will see you guys next time. Bye bye.